Welcome to the Unitarian Church of Los Alamos. Whoever you are, wherever you are in your life's journey, whomever you love, whatever you believe, you're welcome here. This is our Biblical Scholarship and Literacy Religious Education class for adults. This is lecture 22. It took us 22 lectures to get through the book of Exodus. This will be our last lecture on the book of Exodus, and we will be ready to move on. The subject is the golden calf. So if I remind everybody, we have a class webpage with this long URL. I should eventually buy something so you get a shorter way to find it. But for now, it's sites.google.com, view Biblical Scholarship and Literacy, and it has a list of all the lectures. It has links to the different recordings if you want to watch them. It has links to some of the things you might want to, the extra readings and things that I recommend, that sort of stuff. It also has a calendar, which isn't always updated, but I'll try to do that today sometime. If you're watching this online, I'll post the video when I get home today after church. So if we can review, the book of Exodus has three main parts. One on the redemption, that's the story of the Red Sea and the escape from Egypt. The covenant at Sinai, which is all the laws and the covenants and the covenantal meal when they make to make a covenant with Yahweh, including a sacrifice at the end, a covenant meal. This is important because it will be relevant for what happens next. Then we have the section on worship, the instructions for building the tabernacle, and then we have the story of the golden calf, and then we have the actual building of the tabernacle that follows it. So the golden calf is in the middle. Last class, we talked about the building and the instructions. We put those two together and we discussed the instructions for the tabernacle and then the building of the tabernacle. And that's what we did last time. There are 13 chapters there. And so if we just briefly want to get our head around where we were at, why are there 13 chapters of a 40-chapter book on architectural plans, basically? And what we said is that the tabernacle represents sort of a fulfillment of the entire story. The point of the story from the creation of the world, the reason God made the world, the reason for all the Abraham, Isaac, the flood, the Tower of Babel, Moses, the parting of the Red Sea, is to get us to Mount Sinai so that two things can happen, so that people can know God and dwell with God. And the way that happens is on Mount Sinai, because Mount Sinai is where God lives. God lives on Mount Sinai at the top in this fiery pillar of smoke and fire at the top. And the tabernacle is a way of getting God to go with them. In other words, to take God from Mount Sinai to the land of promise and bring God with them. We said that this story probably represents a certain ancestral memory that the worship of Jehovah came from the south, which is mentioned several other places in the Bible, and probably from the land of Midian. In the land of Midian, we have Egyptian records that mention the worship of a god, Yahweh, or Jehovah, Yahweh, in the south. So we have extra biblical references to a god with this name who was in Midian. So the story of Moses is this guy who he leaves Egypt and he goes to Midian. There he meets a woman, he gets married to her. His father-in-law is a Midianite priest. And there he learns that the name of his god that he's always worshipped as El is actually Yahweh. So that there seems to be some historical kernel to that story, that Yahweh is picked up in the south and then brought to the north with the people. And so the tabernacle is this portable house of God that lets them take Yahweh with him from Mount Sinai to the land of Israel. And it has significance relevant to the creation. These are the four main things we mentioned last time: the creation, the Garden of Eden, Mount Sinai, and a palace or home house for God. It has many historical parallels from Greece on the upper left here. All the way in the upper left here we have Greece, Egypt here and here. This is from Mesopotamia. These are Israelite temples, early Israelite temples that all have parallels to this tabernacle as it's remembered by the biblical author P. Sandwiched between the command for it and the building of it is the golden calf. And the golden calf is this alternate covenant. Remember here in 19 through 24 we had a covenant that included sacrifices and a covenant meal. Here we have an alternate covenant that stands in opposition to the entire purpose of the Exodus. According to the logic of the story, this is a big deal. It's a big problem because the people are derailing the entire purpose of everything that came before. And so this alternate meal has elements that are similar to what we saw back in Exodus 19 through 24, repeated. It also has elements similar to the tabernacle. It's an alternate temple, basically. And so it threatens to derail things, but it doesn't succeed. And I think that failure to succeed is an important point because, the way this story was told growing up, in my Mormon bringing and in several other religious traditions, I've seen the same idea, Christian traditions, that God planned to give Moses this great thing, right? And he made a covenant with Moses, and then Moses, immediately the people broke the covenant. And this is the whole point. Judaism has failed, and God makes a lesser covenant with them, right? They broke the true covenant he wanted to make, so he breaks a lesser covenant with them. Well, there's no hint of that in the text. The story picks off exactly where it left off, and it continues. And so the covenants, and the idea comes from this Christian concept that the Mosaic covenant is somehow a lesser covenant, and so they justify that lesser covenant with this golden calf episode, right? The golden calf is when they went off the rails, and then God had to make a lesser covenant with them. But they make the covenant, you'll notice in the structure of the text, way back here, before the golden calf. The point here is that the covenant is threatened and almost derailed, but they continue. And so there is no concept that they failed. There is no concept that the covenant was lost, no concept that a lesser covenant was made. He breaks the stone tablets. I even heard this theory that when he breaks the stone tablets, a different law is written on them because the original tablets had the truth, and this new tablets had a lesser law. There's no hint of that. In fact, it says in the text that what's written on the new tablets is exactly what was written on the old. So let's go through this story. Now, it's going to seem strange, but before I tell you the story of the golden calf, I'm going to jump ahead several hundred years, and I'm going to read a story from 1 Kings, chapters 12 through 13. And I hope that by the time I'm done, it'll be obvious why I did that. So let's skip to this story in 1 Kings. And what is this story? Well, it's hard to jump around like this, but we kind of have to because the stories reference each other. But there was a guy named Saul and another guy named David. You've heard of David and Saul, and then Solomon. Solomon was David's son. These are the original kings of Israel. So again, the arc of the story is to take people from Egypt, slaves in Egypt, and make a nation out of them with a king. And so the monarchy is kind of where we're headed. So David and Solomon are the first two kings. After David dies, Solomon reigns, and he builds the Temple of Solomon. And to build the Temple of Solomon, he has a bunch of people working for him. They're working hard. And then Solomon dies, and the people kind of say, we've had enough. We'd like, some tax relief, basically. And this forced work on the temple is just too much. We want to break. And so we have in chapter 12, verse 3, they sent and called him. And Jeroboam and all the assembly of Israel came and said to Rehoboam. Now, Rehoboam is Solomon's son. So he should be the next king. Jeroboam is this upstart guy in the north who God came to and said, I'm going to make a king out of you, which is kind of strange because Rehoboam should be king. We have this hint that God is going to make Jeroboam into a king. And so Jeroboam and all the people come to Rehoboam, Solomon's son. This is a picture of Rehoboam on the throne here. And they said, your father made our yoke heavy. In other words, it was hard to work for your dad. Now, therefore, lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke that he placed upon us, and then we will serve you forever. And he said to them, go away 3 days, come back, and I'll let you know. So he's going to think about it for 3 days. And while he thinks about it, he gathers all his advisors around and says, what should I say to these people who want to break? They want my taxes to be less, right? So 3 days go by, and Jeroboam and all the people come to Rehoboam, and the king says, come to me again. And the king answered the people harshly, and he disregarded the advice of the older men that they had given him. So remember I said he went to his servants and said, what should we do? His older advisors said, you should do what they say. Give the people a break, and they'll love you forever. You'll be a popular king. So he disregards their advice, and he spake to them according to the advice of his younger advisors. And he said, my father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions. So the king did not listen to the people because it was a turn of affairs brought about by the Lord. This was part of God's plan. Skipping ahead, verse 20. When all of Israel heard that Jeroboam had returned, they sent and called him to the assembly and made him king over Israel. So what happened? There's a rebellion against Solomon's heir, and Rehoboam becomes king over a nation that they call Israel. This is called the divided monarchy. In other words, Israel splits in two. What used to be one nation of Israel, ruled over by David and Solomon, becomes two nations. One ruled over by Jeroboam, and the other in the south by Rehoboam. Rehoboam keeps the south, Jeroboam takes the north. This is a civil war. This is interesting in part because somewhere in the biblical narrative we move from myth to mythicized history, a memory with kernels of history into it, to history, spun history with an agenda, but history, where things really happen, and we know they happen because we have reference to them from outside sources. The divided monarchy is roughly when the history section begins. We know this happened. The united monarchy, there's some debate about whether the united monarchy has ever happened, whether it's a myth, whether it's a mythicized history, whether it's got a kernel of truth to it or not. We don't know. But somewhere right about this point is when we move from these myths to where we actually have historical records that we can verify and say, yes, this stuff really happened. So this is right at that kind of transition moment. What's really interesting about this is what Jeroboam does after the division. This is where this becomes relevant for our story. So skipping to verse 26. Then Jeroboam said to himself, now the kingdom may well revert to the house of David. In other words, to David's ancestors. If I don't do something, my rebellion will fail. So what does he do? If this people continue to go to offer sacrifice in the house of Yahweh in Jerusalem, the heart of this people will turn again to their master, King Rehoboam of Judah, and they will kill me and return the kingdom to Rehoboam of Judah. So Jeroboam took counsel, and he made 2 calves of gold, and he said to the people, you have gone up to Jerusalem long enough. Now, by the way, what is he talking about? Well, there was a festival every year in Jerusalem, and that festival celebrated, among other things, the Passover. What was the Passover? The celebration of the Exodus from Egypt, right? And they were supposed to gather in Jerusalem every year to remember this. And Jeroboam says, you've gone to Jerusalem to worship long enough. Can you imagine people in Israel, part of this breakaway state, going down to Jerusalem in the south to worship every year? Well, if you did that long enough, eventually through the priesthood, right, you'll lose the kingdom. He knows that. So instead he says, you've gone there long enough. Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. He made 2 golden calves, and he set one in Bethel, and the other he put in Dan. These are the 2 places, at the north and south end of his kingdom. And then he has his own festival, and he sets up a festival where people will go to these temples instead of the temple of Jerusalem every year to celebrate. So he set up an alternate worship service. This is important because it sets up what will happen in the Exodus story. The story goes on, and it's worth telling. A non-named prophet shows up and condemns him for his false worship of a golden calf. He stretches forth his hand and says, seize him, and then his hand is somehow withered and he can't bring it back. It probably has leprosy or something. And he begs the prophet to forgive him, and the prophet heals his hand and he brings it back. But then he doesn't repent, and the 2 temples stay. Temple in Dan and Jerusalem. This is the story of Jeroboam and his stretched out hand. Here is the remnant of his temple in Dan. It's still there. Again, whoever wrote this story is referencing historical realities. These 2 temples in Dan and Bethlehem. Those are the 2 temples that Jeroboam set up. Those temples really existed. They're historical, and he's referencing it. Whether the story of where they came from is historical or not, we don't know. But the story is they came from Jeroboam when he rebelled from Rehoboam. But there's the temple in Dan. Notice it would have had, the metal piece is a reconstruction of the altar that would have sat there, is the idea.
This is somebody's phone. Is anybody here?
We seem to have a missing phone, so if anyone left your phone here, we'll put it...
Put it in the office.
The office is locked?
Office is locked. I'll figure it out.
We'll figure out some way to get that to you if you've lost it. Okay, so notice, these are your gods. Remember that phrase, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Something that's important to mention here, this is not the worship of a different God. This is a worship of the God who brought them up out of the land of Israel in a different way. And if you remember my discussion on the evolution of monotheism, this is important, isn't it? Because do you remember there was a God who was an authentic Canaanite God who was worshipped before Israelites got there, before the nation of Israel existed, and his name was El. El was a fertility deity. This is again important. You notice Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, it's all about fertility. They fail in fertility and they beg this God, El, and El helps them have children even though they're too old to have children. All of them have fertility issues. El is a fertility God, and he really existed, and he was worshipped as a symbol of either an old man on a throne, sometimes like Abraham, by the way, a patriarch who has many children, or El is worshipped as a calf, because calves with their horns are symbols of power, authority, and, you guessed it, fertility. So El is a genuine fertility deity. Yahweh seems to be a God that we have reference to in in Midian, which is where Moses comes from, right? And the Levites. So the theory is, and this is just a theory, but it seems to make a lot of sense, this is our working hypothesis, that some people hung out in Egypt, they escaped, they were Levites, they pick up the worship of a god named Yahweh in Canaan, and somehow the thought comes when they in Midian, and when they get to Canaan, they merge with the Canaanites, and they become the nation of Israel. Notice this. And then these two gods, El and Yahweh, merge. And it's the merging of the gods. Instead of saying, my God is better than yours, or let's worship both of them, they say, these are the same being. And it's the merger of those two deities that gives us the origin of monotheism itself. I mean, all of monotheism traces its root back to the merger of these two deities. Worshipping El with a golden calf is an authentic early way of worshiping El, but it is not how Yahweh wants to be worshipped. So when these two gods merge, there is conflict over the older worship of El, which still happens in the northern kingdom of Israel, where Jeroboam sets up two altars, one in Dan and one in Bethlehem. That's the old worship of El with this golden calf. The worship of Yahweh, coming from the Yahwists and the Levites, who probably are the ones who came out of Egypt, if anyone did. There's conflict between those two groups about how El Yahweh, this new being, should be worshipped. So let's go to the golden calf story now in the Exodus and see how this, what I would say is a later, the story of the golden calves at Dan and Bethel comes first. Even though in the chronology of the text, the story of the golden calf in the Exodus happens first, right? But in the order of how these stories were written, the reality of the worship at Dan and things probably happens first, and then this gets retroactively inserted, which is why I read them in this order instead of the other order, into the Exodus story. So in the Exodus story, we also have a golden calf, but that golden calf makes reference to the Jeroboam story, which tells us that the Jeroboam story came first, because the one is pointing at the other. There's lots of reasons, actually, to order them in that direction. So, authorship. Now we're also going to call back to some of the early stuff we said several classes ago. If you've missed those, the short version is that we believe that there are several sources for the text, J, E, D, and P. And these are different traditions that got woven together into the Bible, the first 5 books of the Bible as we have them today. The tabernacle story is written by P. The golden calf story is an interjection by J and E. And so you can actually read the P story, and it makes perfect sense if you just kind of take this stuff out. So from the perspective of the redactor, the person who told the whole story, there's a flow to this, and that flow is God commanded the tabernacle, the people rebelled, it's almost like a mini fall, but Moses intervenes, and the people get back on track, and then we continue as if nothing had happened. And so that's part of the logic of the story as we have it. But you can also see the logic of each individual source as you just kind of read, if you read them in isolation. The golden calf story is difficult to pry apart in terms of J and E. It's not clear always which piece is written by who. We have some ideas, but I don't think we know. Those were kind of woven together in a way that is very hard to pry apart. So here would have been the original flow of the peace story without any golden calf stuff involved. There's instructions for the tabernacle that ends in the command of the Sabbath, and Moses and God writing on 2 tablets of stone. Skip, no golden calf. Then immediately Moses' face shines or is disfigured, depending on what that text means. It's hard to read. We'll talk about that at the end. And then we get, these are the things that God commanded Moses, and then leading with the Sabbath. So notice, there's the Sabbath, the things God commanded written on tablets. Moses' face shines from the glory of the Lord. These are the things that God commanded that are written on the tablets, starting with the Sabbath and then the building of the tabernacle. So you start with the building, the instructions, all the way down to Moses' face shining, and then you go back the other way. And the whole thing just kind of fits together in this flow with no golden calf in the middle. But if we get to the golden calf story, this is this interwoven J and E. This is kind of what we have. So this is the story as we have it today. The tabernacle is commanded, and the Sabbath and the 2 tablets, that stuff we just mentioned. And then we move immediately to Moses' delaying on the top of the mountain, presumably getting the instructions for the tabernacle, right? So he's delaying on the top of the mountain, and so Aaron makes a golden calf. God is angry, and he expresses that anger to Moses, who's still up on the mountain. Moses changes God's mind because God wants to kill everybody. Moses goes down and breaks the tablets, kills a bunch of Israelites. There's a plague, all this stuff. Aaron makes some excuses. Aaron makes excuses. Then there's the who's on the Lord's side. That's when Moses kills all the people. There's a plague. And then there's this discussion about whether God's even going to go with them at this point. Will the story be derailed? Will God go with them into the land of Israel? Moses convinces God to go. Moses sees God's face and sees his back because he can't see his face. It's too glorious. And then we get these new tablets made, a new covenant, and then suddenly we get this discussion of Moses' face shining from seeing God. Then we're back to P, in other words, right? So you can see the interjection. We believe the first part is mostly E, the second part is mostly J, but they're actually mixed together. It's very hard to tell. And so I've got here the P, E, J, P sections, but again, the E and P stuff is kind of mixed. But this is the outline of the story as we have it. So let's go through each of these pieces. Chapter 32, verses 1 through 6, Moses delays. So let's see. Chapter 32, verse 1, when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered around Aaron and said to him, "Come, make gods for us. Who shall go before us? As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." I need to make a point here that it is currently believed that P is an Aaronite priest. In other words, P is a descendant of Aaron. And E, who's writing here, we believe, was probably priests who claimed to be descendants of Moses. And so you'll notice how E denigrates Moses. E will denigrate Aaron. Aaron built this golden calf, so Aaron isn't all that great. This is internal conflict between the E priests and the P priests, right? The Mosaic priests and the Aaronite priests. Anyway, so Aaron makes this thing. Aaron says to them, verse 2, "Take off the gold rings that are on your ears and of your wives, your sons and your daughters, and bring them to me." So the people took off all the gold from their ears and brought them to Aaron. And he took the gold from them and formed it into a mold and cast an image of a calf. And they said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." Notice something that doesn't make any sense. These, plural, are your gods, but he made one calf. Where did the "these are your gods who brought you up out of the land of Israel" come from? That's a quote from Kings. We just read it. When Jeroboam makes 2 golden calves and says, "These are your gods," they're quoting it directly, and they're quoting it in a way that doesn't actually make sense in this place. In other words, the plural doesn't make sense, but the plural's here because they're quoting the first Kings. This is one of the reasons why we think the first Kings text comes first, and then gets quoted here in a way that doesn't quite make sense. But the reference is clear. It's intended. They're making a connection between this singular golden calf and those plural golden calves from Jeroboam's time. "These are your gods who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." And when Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made a proclamation saying, "Tomorrow shall be a festival unto the Lord." Did you notice that, by the way, a festival? That's exactly, remember Jeroboam made the 2 things and then made a new festival? This is the same thing. It's an alternate worship of Jehovah not a worship of a different God. They're not worshiping a different God. They're worshiping Jehovah, Yahweh, in a different way than Jehovah commanded. And again, this is probably a memory of a fight that happened between these early Canaanite methods for worshiping El and the Yahwist rules for how you worship Yahweh coming from the Levites. All right. Let's see, let me find my place. And they rose up early the next day and offered burnt offerings and brought sacrifices of well-being, and the people sat down to eat, drink, and they rose up to revel. This probably has sexual overtones. So their worship service sounds a lot more fun than the sort of thing I had on Sunday morning. They're probably having some sort of an orgy. Problems are abounding. Let's see. Let me skip to the next section. God's anger is expressed to Moses. Moses is still on the mountain, but God, of course, sees what's happening. So God says to Moses, "Let me alone so that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them with fire, and I will make of you a great nation." So God is bound. The text is very clear. God made a promise to Abraham that he would make a great nation out of him. And so God is bound to do that. But Moses is, according to the logic of the story, a descendant of Abraham. So God says, "Moses, I'm just going to kill those people because they're crazy and they're doing all this bad stuff, right? So I'm going to kill them, and I'm going to make my great nation out of you." Give me a second to get my thing fixed. "I'm going to make a great nation out of you instead of out of them. But that way it'll still be a great nation made out of Abraham. I'll still keep my covenant to Abraham, but I'm going to kill all of them, and I'm just going to make a great nation out of you. I'm going to start over with you. They're so sinful, I'm just going to start over with Moses." This is the sort of thing a priest descended from Moses might say. You can see also the political infighting working its way into the story. But Moses implored the Lord his God and said, "O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say, 'It was evil intent that Jehovah brought them out to kill them in the mountains and to consume them from the face of the earth'? Turn your face from wrath, change your mind, and do not bring disaster on your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, he promised," etc., etc. And then at the end it says, "And the Lord changed his mind about the disaster that he planned to bring on his people." Notice what just happened here. Moses basically says, "God, if you kill these people, the Egyptians are going to look at it and say, 'Man, that God's kind of mean. Aren't we glad we're worshiping different gods? We don't want to worship him. He kills his own people. This God's a dangerous God to worship. Let's not hang out with.'" And God's like, that's a good point. I better not do this. Notice how God changes his mind. If you don't like that concept, I'm sorry. Here it is. Right? It's in the text. But notice how it kind of makes for this anthropomorphic God. Right? This is a being who's much like us, that you can talk to, reason with, who gets angry, who has bad ideas, and gets talked down from his bad ideas by a lowly mortal. This is the sort of God portrayed by the text. And we have to kind of take that seriously, not seriously in the sense that I think that's what God is like, but seriously in the sense that the people who wrote this book did. They thought that's what God was like. And I think we shouldn't just apologize for it and pretend it doesn't say what it says, right? We just have to say, okay, that's the sort of being these people believed in. So Moses talks God down. Notice also the role of a priest is to, think of the way to say this. The role of a priest is to mediate between God and man. And so Moses is taking that role of a priest. By talking God down, he's mediating between God and man. So now Moses goes down. And now God was just mad. Moses talked him down. Now Moses goes down and they see, he gets halfway down and he meets Joshua. And Joshua's like, "I think there's a war going on down there. I hear all this noise." And he's like, "No, that's not a war. That's people reveling." Again, sexual overtones in the Hebrew word. There's an orgy going on down there. It's not a war. It's something else. And then in verse 19, as soon as Moses, came down and saw the calf and the dancing and the other stuff they were doing, Moses' anger burned hot, and he threw the tablets from his hands and broke them at the foot of the mountain. And he took the calf that they had made, burned it with fire, ground it to powder, scattered it on the water, and made the Israelites drink it. That's kind of weird. Right? So what did he do? He took it. He took a golden calf, crushed it to powder, burned it with fire, crushed its ashes to powder, scattered it on the water, and made the Israelites drink it. This idea of drinking ashes scattered on water is common in the ancient Near East. It shows up in the story of Anath and Mot. where Anath, the goddess, kills the Canaanite god Mot, burns him with fire and scatters his ashes on the water, and then the people drink it. This story also shows up in Numbers chapter 5, where a woman who's suspected of adultery is supposed to drink a concoction made of the dust and ashes from the sacrificial altar. And presumably if it has no problem, then she's innocent. If it makes her sick, then she's guilty. It's a way of deciding if someone is, it's a ritual, magic practice that's supposed to help you decide if someone is guilty. So there's two things happening. The destruction of the altar, of the golden calf, represents the utter, complete destruction of the false god and the denigration of the false god. And then the drinking is a way of finding out who's guilty of this sin. Then Aaron makes some great excuses, and this is I have to admit, as someone who just kind of enjoys humor, this is dry humor. I have a kind of a dry sense of humor. This is one of my favorite verses ever in the Bible. I love this. Moses comes to Aaron and says, "Why did you do such a great thing, a great sin?" And then Aaron says, "Don't let your anger of the Lord burn hot. You know the people; they're bent on evil, and it's their fault." Remember that the people came to Aaron and said, earlier it says, the people came to Aaron and said, "Moses is delayed, what are we going to do?" And Aaron comes up with the idea of making the golden calf in the first place. And Aaron's like, "Well, you know the people, like they're quick to do evil, it's not my fault." And then he says, "And they said to me, 'Make us gods who shall go before us. And as for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we don't know what has become of him. So I said to them, whoever has gold, take it off." So far he's just kind of describing what happened. "Take it off," and they gave it to me. And then I love this line. "I threw it into the fire, and out came this calf." And I can't tell if he's trying to actually say that it was some miraculous thing, like he just threw the gold in the fire and a calf came out, or if he's actually expecting Moses to buy this, or if he's just trying to kind of deflect his role in all of this, because remember the earlier text said he made a mold and poured the gold into the mold. It made it very clear that Aaron actually did this thing. And Aaron's like, "I just put the gold in there and this calf came out, just kind of magic. It's not my fault." Moses, I don't think, buys that. Anyway, I love Aaron's excuses. I just think it's really funny. And then we get one of the Bible's brighter moments. Moses says, now notice Moses just spent all his time trying to talk the Lord out of killing all the Israelites. Now he's come down and he's made these people drink this concoction. Presumably those who get sick from it are guilty. It doesn't say that, but that's what we get in Numbers 5. So we assume something like that is happening. And then Moses says to them, the people, "Thus saith the Lord, the God of Israel, put your sword on your side, each of you." First he says, I skipped a verse. I apologize. Verse 26. "Then Moses stood in the gate of the camp." The gate of the camp is the place where judges judge. You notice in the book of Judges, they'll stand at the gate and offer judgment. So he's in the place of judgment, and he said, "Who is on the Lord's side? Come to me." Have you ever heard that? Who's on the Lord's side? Who? There's even a song. Who's on the Lord's side? Who? Right? It comes from this really bright and wonderful story. Who's on the Lord's side? And the sons of Levi gather around him, and he said to them, "Thus saith the Lord, the God of Israel, put your sword on your side, each of you, go back and forth from gate to gate throughout the camp, and kill your brother, your friend, and your neighbor." The sons of Levi did as Moses commanded, and about 3,000 of the people fell on that day, presumably the ones who get sick from the concoction or the guilty ones, so he kills those. That's how we figure out who dies and who doesn't. And Moses says, "Today you have ordained yourselves." Notice, instead of saying, "This was a horrible thing, we just had to do it," or instead of saying, "You guys really got carried away, you shouldn't have done that," or just saying, "This is genocide, stop killing people for worshiping differently than you," which would have been really nice. Instead, he says, "Today you have ordained yourselves for service to the Lord, each one at the cost of a son or a daughter, a brother, and so have brought a blessing on yourselves this day." Again, this is not the Bible's brightest moment, in my opinion. I don't think, again, we should downplay this. In the context of the story, it makes some sense. These people are derailing the entire point of the book up to this point, but it's immoral. We can see that quite clearly. And again, if you don't believe in God, then this represents the morality of an ancient people. If you do believe in God, I want to propose that this represents the morality of an ancient group of people of faith expressing their opinion about what God is like in their own context of an Iron Age, desert-dwelling nation for which this sort of behavior was normal. But in no sense, this is why I oppose I've said before, I don't care if you believe or don't believe, but what I oppose is biblical fundamentalism. In other words, the idea that we have to accept that this book is perfect. If this book is perfect, then this sort of behavior is not only right, this is how you ordain yourself as a king, as a priest, and bring blessings upon yourself by behaving like this. And I don't believe that. Right? So however you do that, if you just don't believe in God, that's fine. If you do believe in God, at least we need to come to the conclusion that this text may be an authentic expression of these people's belief, but we don't have to accept their morality and their behavior, because sometimes it is just wrong, unambiguously and clearly wrong. So then we have this discussion about whether God is going to go with them. And have they succeeded in derailing the project? So originally God was going to kill them all, you remember, and Moses talks him down from that. Instead, Moses kills a bunch of them, but not all of them. And then the Lord, it says in 35, the Lord sent a plague on the people because they made the calf. This is, again, another hint, I think, that the people who drank the concoction presumably get sick if they're guilty. This is the magical concoction. And that represents the plague. So Moses kills a bunch of them, then God kills a bunch of them with plague. But again, they're not all dead. And then Moses meets God in the tent of meeting. We had a discussion last time about the tabernacle versus tent of meeting. You can go back and look at that. It's an interesting historical side point. But in the tent of meeting, this happens. God says to Moses in verse 14 of chapter 33, he said, my presence will go with you and I will give you rest. I'm sorry, I got to get some context. Now if I have found favor in your sight, show me your ways that I may know you and find favor in your sight. Consider too that this nation is your people. And he said, my presence will go with you and I will give you rest. And then he said unto him, if your presence not go, and you do not come carry us up from here. I apologize. By the way, I left my own text home, and so I've got notes here trying to tell me which ones to read, and so I'm a little lost. Give me a second. But you have not let know. Let me skip to verse 17. The Lord said to Moses, I will do the very thing that you have asked, for you have found favor in my sight. Moses said, show me your glory. This is the wrong place. 32. I need to start in 32, verse 33. 32, verse 30. I'm getting some echo, too. All right, so here we go. Chapter 33, verse 3. This is the verse I was supposed to read first, and this is why nothing made sense. I skipped something I was supposed to read. Go up to a land flowing with milk and honey, but I will not go up among you, or I would consume you on the way, for you are a stiff-necked people. So this is God speaking to Moses. I'm going to take you to the land of milk and honey, but I'm not going to go with you. Now, what's important is that God had promised to go with them, and now he's saying I won't. And there's several verses in here where he says, I'm going to send an angel with you instead. So I'm going to stay here on Mount Sinai. You get to go up to the land of promise. I'm going to send an angel with you. The angel will help you fight the Canaanites, but I'm not going because I just can't handle being around these people. They're too wicked, and if I do, I'll probably get mad and kill them all. So you go up and send an angel. So we had two elements of derailment, right? The first is God's going to kill them all and make a new nation out of Moses, and Moses talks him down from that. And then God says, I'm going to send them all by themselves. I'll send an angel with them, but I'm not going to go. It's too big a deal. By this whole am I going to go with you thing is important because that's what the tabernacle is for, right? The tabernacle is to build a house so that God can go with them. And now he's saying, I'm not going to go. I'm going to send this angel instead. And then we get the verses I read out of order. Consider too that this nation is your people. And he said, my presence will go with you and I will give you rest. And he said, if your presence not go, do not carry us from hence. Because if you're not going to go with us, I don't want to go. I'd rather stay here with you than go to the land of milk and honey without you. Come with us. And God relents and says, I will come with you. So the idea, this comes back. I think there's two interesting bits. The first is this whole concept of God going with you. I love this picture from a temple in Ain Dara. It's a Syrian temple. It's not Israelite, but it has these... It looks like the Temple of Solomon, right? It's got a Holy of Holies, a holy place, and a porch. And it's got these footprints in the porchway. And you notice how big they are. They're superhuman size. And And what's happening is this temple, it even has this kind of extra rooms around the side. This is exactly what Temple of Solomon looked like. This is the closest parallel to the Temple of Solomon that exists. And it is a pagan temple from Syria. But what I really like about it are the footprints in the front. This is God walking into the temple and not leaving. So God is with them. God is living in the temple, and they're showing them that God's in the temple. Well, the whole point of the tabernacle is for God to go with them. And the point of the text written from somebody later who had a temple is God lives in our temple. He doesn't still live in Mount Sinai. And he's trying to justify this idea that God did go with them. And so the golden calf almost derails the whole story. God almost chooses not to go with them. He almost wipes them out, and then he chooses to go. Again, this idea that shows up in some Christian religions, and especially Mormonism, that the golden calf derails it, and they lose the true covenant, the true good covenant God wanted to give them. He gave them this lesser covenant after, is absent from the text. Moses talks God down, and the whole thing continues exactly like it was going to continue before. God does go with them. He does live in the temple. He does, right, etc. The whole point of the text is to convince you that God lives there. There's no hint of a lesser covenant or anything like this. Then Moses sees God back in chapter 33, verse 17. This is also really fun. If you believe in a God who's kind of nothing and nowhere, that is not the being portrayed here. He has body. He looks like a human. He has hands, feet, and a back. So let's read this story. This is fun. Let's see, 33, starting in verse 17. The Lord said to Moses, I will do the very thing that you have asked, for you have found favor in my sight, and I know you by name. And Moses said, show me your glory, I pray. And he said, I will make all my goodness pass before you, and will proclaim before you my name, the Lord, and I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and will show mercy to whom I will show mercy. But he said, you cannot see my face, for no one shall see my face and live. And the Lord continued, see, here's a place by me. You shall stand on a rock, and when my glory pass by, I will put a cleft in the rock, and I will cover you with my hand until I've passed by. And then I will take away my hand, and you will see my back, but my face shall not be seen. And this is this really great story where Moses gets to see God's back, but he can't see his face because then he would be crispy, presumably. Then Moses makes some new tablets. There's this whole discussion of God's mercy and God's justice that ends in verse 9. Where he says, and now if I have found favor in your sight, O Lord, I pray, let the Lord go with us. Although this is a stiff-necked people, pardon our iniquity and our sin, and take us for your inheritance. Be our God, we'll be your people. Come with us to Jerusalem and dwell with us forever, presumably. And this is the end of God makes a new covenant with them. The new tablets are made. There's a new covenant meal even, and the whole thing is back on track. And we immediately jump into this peace story. Yes, so this is really the end of the Exodus, but I do want to, because then we go back through the building of the tabernacle, which we covered last time. I want to take just a moment, though, and talk about this shining face thing, because it is a little weird, and I think strangely interesting. I would love to spend an entire class on Moses' shining face, because it's interesting. But let's look at verse 29. Now we're back in P. This is the pivot of P, right? The commands to build the Sabbath, and Moses comes down and his face is shining after getting the instruction. And then he gives the instruction to the people, and then the people do everything God commanded with no disobedience anywhere. And so in verse 29, Moses came down from Mount Sinai, and as he came down from the mountain with the two tablets of the covenant in his hand, Moses did not know that the skin of his face, quote, shone, because he had been talking with God. The verb there in Hebrew, translated shone, is one of those one-off that doesn't show up anywhere else, so we don't really know what it means. And we try to figure out what it means by looking at cognates to that word in other languages around Israel and in Israel itself. We try to figure out what it means by looking at all the other words that are similar to it, cognate with it, have similar roots. And what we find is that the word either means to shine or to be burned. You can see how shining things burn up, right? So either shined or burned, or like a horn. Horny, in the sense of like when you know how horns have this rough texture, so burned again to create a rough texture to the face. So that creates. I love Michelangelo's statue of Moses. He has horns on his head. It's from this word. His face was like horned. It had horns on it. Right? He's being very literal in his interpretation. The other option, though, is that he was disfigured. He was so close to God. Not while he saw his back, right? That story is an interjection by E. In P's story, he was up there getting the commandment to build the tabernacle and all that stuff. And when he came back, from being in God's presence, he was disfigured. His face had burned. Or his face shone. So there's the alternate version is Moses was glorified by God so much that his face shone just like God's, and then they put a veil over his face so he doesn't scare the people, either because he's disfigured or because his face is too shiny. And if it's either way, you get this veil over his face. Looks an awful lot like the tabernacle itself, like the glory of God hidden behind a veil, and Moses becomes kind of the embodiment of God's presence among the people. So that's either very laudatory of Moses, right, the veiled face, or kind of degradatory. Moses got too close to God and got himself burned. This is P, we think. If it's really P, the burned makes more sense because P is the Aaronite priesthood. We just had the story about how Aaron messed up from E, and now from P we get this story about how Moses was disfigured because he got himself too close to God, almost like Icarus that got too close to God and his wings melted in the. So it's depending on who wrote this. If it's really P, the disfigured maybe makes some sense. But again, we don't know what the word means, so it makes it really hard to interpret. But there's probably very interesting ritual and cultural stuff behind the meaning that they would have understood back when they knew what the word meant. And then the story continues. Remember last time I said the whole goal was to meet, ya'ad, and to know, yada, God. And now the people meet God, they know God, they build the tabernacle as commanded, the priests are consecrated, and they head into the promised land. And that is then the story of Exodus. Now, there's more obviously that has to happen. Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy are still to come. But the core of Exodus has been told in this book. This story is important. It matters. It sets the stage for all the biblical stories that follow, and it's very important to Christians, Jews, and to even our modern culture and society. For the Jews, it's the origin story, their very origin as a people, and their yearly Passover celebrates these events. For the Christians, Matthew borrows from this story and turns Jesus into a new Moses, and the Sermon on the Mount is a new Mount Sinai from which new laws are given. The Lord's Supper in 3 of the Gospels is explicitly connected to the Passover. Christ's death is described as the sacrifice of the Lamb on Passover. Paul compares baptism to passing through the Red Sea, and the book of Hebrews describes the journey, our journey through life, as the journey the Israelites took through the wilderness to their own promised land, just as we go to heaven. In a modern society, this story has been the backbone of discussions on everything from countless movies, musical stories, and literature, to original debates about slavery. Black slaves in the South told this story and retold this story and saw it as a hint of their future deliverance and the way that God wanted to deliver them from slavery. And at the same time, the slaveholders from the North quoted the passages about how to have and keep slaves as evidence that God intended slavery to continue. Both sides used the story. It's challenging. You see that even in how the two different sides used the story. It has complex questions of authorship. Who wrote it? When? Why? What was it influenced by? It has complex questions of historicity. Did any of this ever happen? We don't know. It has stories of violence, drowning of Egyptians in the sea, Moses killing all the Israelites who worshiped God wrong. Maybe even that has historical roots. This could be a memory of how the Levites enforced their view of how to worship God on the earlier people who worshipped El. You could see some of this has maybe even happened. Intense stories of violence, and you have to ask the question, if you believe any of this is inspired, how do stories of such violence and evil make their way into the story? We have stories of this strange anthropomorphic God who can be talked out of things, who has a body, who has a back, who has hands, who walks and talks with the people. This story is challenging, it's inspirational. People have drawn inspiration from it for centuries, millennia, and it has meant the world to a great many people, Jews, Christians, Muslims, and others. And so I hope that I've done some sort of justice to the story of the Exodus and to its meaning, and next time we'll get together and we will discuss the book of Leviticus, which is, of course, a large number of priestly laws about how priests and the people are to behave, to be holy In fact, the main theme of the Exodus for the preview is, "Be ye therefore holy, as I the Lord am holy." And in this sense, holy means like God. The story of how to be like God so that God can dwell with you and come back. So these are laws that we'll discuss next time. I've got several resources. These are the same ones I've given last time. This great commentary by Prop. He has like 8 chapters on the shining burned face, which you can read. You want 8 full chapters, full pages of discussion of that. It's in there. If you want kind of a simpler read, Pete Enns has this great podcast called The Bible for Normal People. He's got a 7, I think, series on Exodus, which he then turned into a shorter book called Pete Ruins Exodus. He has the same sort of dry humor, apparently, that I do. I recommend both the podcast and the book if you want to listen to it. It's I think, only like 6 hours to listen to the whole book if you'd get it in audiobook for Pete Ruins Exodus. This book is really fun. This is the Bible, its sources revealed by Friedman. He also wrote a book called Who Wrote the Bible? Who Wrote the Bible has a section, I think that our days at least, definitive discussion of the sources, P, J, E, and D. And so if you want to know what those sources are, what he thinks they came from, where they came from, what their political ideologies were, when they were written, the dates for those, he's got this great book, Who Wrote the Bible? And just for fun, the sources revealed is just the biblical text, color-coded. So you can see, just as you're reading along, it changes color whenever the author changes. And it becomes really nice to just kind of tell who's writing, according to his best guess, who wrote which piece. Very useful. I use it for this class, getting ready for it. That's my go-to source for who the heck wrote this part, you know. Sometimes I can just tell. I've gotten to the point where I can read it and I go, yeah, that's P, I can tell, right? But if I'm ever confused, I kind of turn to him, and he'll often say, I don't know. He'll color code it and then have a footnote and says, I really can't tell here, but it's really fun. I love that. Just that reading it that way is a lot of fun. So those are my recommended sources. Are there any burning questions before we quit? And then I'll see you next month for Leviticus. Does anyone have any parting thoughts, questions, comments? Nope. All right, I'll see you next month. Thanks, everybody.